Gas prices crossing $4 a gallon feels like one of those problems people think they understand instantly. You pull into a station, stare at the screen a little longer than usual, and assume the damage ends there. Your tank costs more. Your weekly routine gets slightly tighter. Maybe you cut one small expense and move on. But that's almost never how an oil shock works. The real story begins after you leave the gas station, because once fuel prices jump like this, they don't stay inside your car, they spread. They move through delivery trucks, grocery shelves, airline tickets, business costs, household budgets, and eventually into something much bigger. How the entire economy behaves next. What makes this moment different is not just the price itself, but what it signals. Gas prices rising above that level usually means something deeper is happening in the energy system. It can point to supply disruptions, global tensions, or demand that hasn't cooled the way people expected. And energy is not just another product. It is one of the few things that quietly touches almost everything else. When fuel gets expensive, it doesn't ask permission before affecting other prices. It simply moves through the system. Think about how everyday life adjusts, not in theory, but in real decisions. A family that suddenly pays more for gas doesn't treat that as a separate category forever. They adjust somewhere else. Maybe it's one less takeaway meal, a delayed online purchase, a skipped trip, or choosing cheaper brands at the store. None of these changes feel dramatic on their own, but across millions of households, they begin to shift the direction of spending. The economy rarely changes because one big switch flips. It changes because small decisions slowly lean in the same direction. Groceries are where this becomes impossible to ignore. Fuel is built into the entire journey of food. It powers farming equipment, refrigeration, transportation, and storage. By the time something reaches a shelf, it has already absorbed energy costs multiple times. So when gas prices rise, it creates a quiet pressure that can keep food prices from falling as easily as people hope. Even if some items stabilize, others stay elevated, and the overall feeling becomes clear, things are not getting cheaper in the way they were supposed to. That's why gas prices don't just affect wallets, they affect perception. People don't track detailed inflation reports, but they understand patterns. If gas is expensive and groceries aren't easing, the conclusion feels obvious. Something is still wrong. That perception matters because the economy runs partly on confidence. When people feel like their money isn't stretching as far, they become more cautious. And caution spreads faster than optimism. This is where the timing becomes critical. Gas prices aren't rising in a vacuum. They're rising at a moment when many households are already stretched. Housing is expensive, borrowing costs are high, credit cards carry heavy interest, monthly bills haven't fully relaxed. So when fuel rises again, it doesn't feel like a new problem. It feels like confirmation that relief keeps getting pushed further away, and that emotional weight changes behavior. Spending doesn't collapse overnight, it softens. Some people keep spending as usual, but others start adjusting immediately. Some reduce travel. Some cut back on non-essential purchases. Some delay bigger decisions entirely. Businesses note as a sudden drop, but as a gradual hesitation. Fewer impulse buys. Slower growth, slightly quieter demand, and when enough of those signals appear at once, it begins to shape the broader economy. But the story doesn't stop at consumer behavior. This is where it connects to something much bigger, the Federal Reserve. Most people see gas prices and interest rates as separate worlds. One feels like a daily annoyance, the other like distant policy. But they are linked by one powerful concept: inflation expectations. When gas prices rise sharply, it changes how people think about future prices. Even if everything else hasn't moved yet, the signal is strong. Energy costs are climbing again. That can make businesses more cautious and sometimes more aggressive at the same time. Cautious in spending, but aggressive in pricing. If they expect higher costs ahead, they may adjust prices sooner rather than later. And that's exactly the kind of behavior the Fed watches closely. The central bank isn't just tracking current inflation. It's trying to understand where inflation is going and how people are reacting to it. If energy prices start pushing expectations upward again, it complicates everything. Because now, even if some parts of inflation are cooling, others are pushing back in the opposite direction. And that creates a problem. Markets often move ahead of reality. They look at trends and try to predict what comes next. So when inflation starts to ease even slightly, investors begin to expect rate cuts. Lower rates would make borrowing cheaper, support markets, and bring some relief across the system. But when gas prices rise again, that path becomes less clear. Suddenly, the risk of inflation sticking around longer comes back into focus, and that puts the Fed in a difficult position. Cutting rates too early while energy-driven pressure is rising could send the wrong signal. It could suggest that inflation is under control when it isn't fully settled. And if inflation resurges, the consequences are worse than simply waiting a little longer. That's why central banks tend to move cautiously in moments like this. They prefer to delay relief rather than risk making a mistake they can't easily reverse. This is the deeper connection most people don't immediately see. A jump in gas prices doesn't just affect your weekly budget. It can influence the timing of interest rate cuts. And if those cuts are delayed, it keeps borrowing costs higher for longer. That affects mortgages, business loans, credit cards, and investment decisions. In other words, one shock in energy can ripple into the entire financial environment. And that's where the tension builds. People are already waiting for relief. They expect rates to come down. They expect conditions to ease. But rising fuel costs push that relief further away. It creates a kind of loop. Higher gas prices keep inflation pressure alive. Inflation pressure keeps the Fed cautious. And a cautious Fed keeps rates elevated, which then feeds back into the feeling that everything is still expensive. What makes this even more complicated is how quickly sentiment can change. One week, markets feel confident that rate cuts are coming soon. The next, energy prices jump and that confidence fades. That back and forth creates instability not just in markets but in expectations. People don't just react to what is happening. They react to what they thought was going to happen and now isn't. And over time, that gap between expectation and reality becomes its own problem. If people keep expecting relief that doesn't arrive, frustration builds. Spending decisions become more cautious. Businesses hesitate. Confidence weakens, not because something catastrophic happened, but because something expected didn't. In the end, gas prices above $4 are not just a number. They are a signal that pressure is returning in a place that affects everything else. A signal that inflation may not be as settled as it seemed. And a signal that the path to relief, lower prices, lower rates, easier conditions, may be longer than people want to believe, because the real impact of an oil shock is never just what you pay at the pump. It's what happens after.